Welcome to the second installment of A Plus Education Unplugged. Uh, these are meant to be relatively informal conversations. No PowerPoints, sorry, no papers, no presentations, and an opportunity to meet with some interesting folks doing interesting work. And learn a few things and maybe be inspired to explore some of the topics later. So thank you guys for joining us. I want to welcome our two guests today. I'm so excited to have these amazing rock star research professors. And let me introduce them and then we'll get into the conversation. And just for our guests, you are welcome to provide questions, insights in the chat, and I or our guests will try and respond to those. We're going to spend the first 20 minutes or so just in conversation with the three of us, and then we'll get into the audience participation. So we're fortunate to have Dr. Ayesha Hashim, who is an assistant professor from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She's sitting in her magical library. And then we're also joined by Professor Julie Marsh, who is at the University of Southern California. I always mispronounce it. Is it Rossier?
Rossier.
Okay, the Rossier School of Education. I should know better. And we're here. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about their latest book. Challenging the One Best System, the Portfolio Management Model, and Urban School Governance. And they are the co-authors of this book with Katrina Bulkley, Catherine Strunk, Doug Harris, another group of amazing research folks from around the country. So before we start, I just want to check in with you guys. How are you guys doing during this pandemic before we get into sort of some of the meat on the education?
Ayesha, you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, I was just updating Van on how much I'm enjoying Chapel Hill, living in a small town with lots of outdoor space. I have two kids under the age of 5. And so being able to be outside and play and enjoy nature has become a big part of like what we do every day for fun. So honestly feeling, I mean, it's, I'm sure it's been rough for me, like it's been rough for everyone, but also feeling really blessed to just seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. I got my first vaccine dose last Monday. So just excited to hopefully get things back to normal and feeling really fortunate to live in a lovely place where I can, I can still enjoy life outdoors, which has been nice.
That's great. I got my first vaccine yesterday and planning on snowboarding this weekend.
Yes, exactly.
So to try and compensate for all of the other incredible losses. How about you, Julie?
Yeah, I'm doing okay. I think I'm a little bit more hopeful. Yeah, I think it was a relief to get my parents vaccinated. They're now fully vaccinated, and my kids got to give them hugs this weekend for the first time in over a year, and it was amazing. And they're in middle and high school, and the schools are starting to open in Los Angeles, and so we're actually going to be seeing a couple of days on campus soon. So I'm feeling hopeful.
Yeah, it's sort of remarkable. In fact, the timing, at least as I look at the weather here, as the days get longer and it gets warmer and sunnier. Yeah. So maybe before we get into the research in the book, I'm just curious, like, how is it that you guys get into doing research on school districts? Like, do you were you in high school and looking out on your from your trig class window thinking, oh gosh, I wonder how this school is organized, and I wonder how these schools in this district are organized? I think I'm going to sort of set off on a career of studying education in school districts and organization and governance. Like how does that happen?
I mean, I know for me, it started, I did my PhD with Milbury McLaughlin at Stanford, and she and Mike Knapp and Linda Darling Hammond had a big project looking at systems for sort of supporting instructional improvement. And so I started really learning and thinking about districts when I was doing my PhD. And my dissertation ended up looking at 2 different school districts and how they were trying to engage community members and citizens in their reforms. And so I just became very interested in kind of organizations, and the district level seemed like a really important level that hadn't received a lot of attention. Jim Spillane at the time was doing some work around school districts and understanding like that they're not these monolithic organizations, they actually are quite different. So for me, it kind of was sparked, I think, in grad school, having already done some research at the sort of school level and had done some choice work even before, and had done a master's in public policy where I had been really thinking about systems. But yeah, I would say my PhD program really was where it sort of started for me.
Ayesha, what?
Yeah, and for me, I mean, I bring a bit of an international lens to the story. So I just became a U.S. citizen this year, but when I started, before my PhD studies, I was out in India. That's kind of my home country, and I had I was working in a nonprofit helping like at-risk youth complete secondary education, which at the time wasn't mandatory in India. And we were in this interesting setting where choice, like the idea of like giving kids scholarships to go to private schools was actually life-changing for these kids. And it was incredibly affordable. Education in India just doesn't cost anything, like when you're talking about going to a private school. And so that was where I started to like just learn about things such as choice, but also like feeling constrained, like working in a nonprofit sector, like how to change schools from the outside and not really being able to change policy at the system level. And that desire to kind of influence system change from the inside is what motivated me to do my research or pursue a PhD in education. And then I became Julie's student. So it just felt very natural to actually focus that as, at the school district level as this kind of perfect balance of like an entity kind of managing a system of schools. But like Julie said, there being a lot of variation across districts and different kinds of relationships with communities. And so that became like the level at which I wanted to like start to learn about like the implementation, the design and implementation of reforms, including those that look at choice, expanding choice for kids.
Great. So interesting. It's so interesting how connected many of the webs of inquiry are. I was also a student of Milbury. I didn't when I was in graduate school. And so it's just funny how all of these things sort of connect. And that was a long time ago. That was 30 years ago, geez. Anyway, let's talk a little bit about the book. This is, for those of us that are wonks, and I think I shared earlier, this is the best book I've read so far of 2021. And I think that it is, it's so interesting because it gets into so many different features of 3 urban school districts, Los Angeles, Denver, and New Orleans, and sort of explores research from a variety of different perspectives. I was wondering if one of you might just take a minute or two and just describe why you did the book and what you were hoping to do by publishing the book.
Yeah, maybe I'll go for this. So this was sponsored by Lyle Spencer grant. If you recall, it was the first year that the Spencer Foundation put out a call for research on, it was about practice. And we thought we all have been studying these districts, right? Doug Harris had been in New Orleans for years. Catherine and I and Ayesha had been in LAUSD. We were very interested in Denver. Katie Bulkley had been studying various cities around the country as well. And we had all been sort of interested in this idea of how reforms actually translated down to practice at a school level. So we went for this grant. We did, a lot of sort of mixed methods work as a team. And over time, as we were getting, gobs of survey data, and we had done, 21 school case studies and interviews at the state and district level, we realized we had so much to say that it didn't make sense to start doing these sort of individual papers, which we all wanted, right? And we are still doing. And there are pieces of the book that have been broken down into more in-depth papers. I know Aisha's even working on one now. But the idea was that we really actually needed a book to tell the story, to tell this sort of complex story that we were sort of tracing the kind of this idea of a portfolio model from its in theory, what it looks like in design, and then actually what it looks like when enacted from the system level down to the school level, and even considering parents' perspectives as well. So the complexity of it really needed a book. And we wanted to go really in depth into really looking at each of these elements, these mechanisms of change, the sort of theory behind them, how they actually played out, what were the challenges of actually implementing these things, and to what effect. And so we needed a book to tell that story, I would say. Ayesha, I don't know if you want to add to that.
No, I think that's that. Yeah, I think that was a good, a complete answer of what was like motivating the book for sure.
And what is like, what was the, what were the biggest surprises in doing this? I mean, as you said, a number of you have been studying these school districts and cities for quite a while. It's always good to have dogs and animals and children in these things. So please welcome them. We'll say hello. So what about surprises?
Surprises. Do you want to go?
I mean, I think some of the surprises were the challenges that we saw with, like, so like we kind of conceptualized the theory behind a portfolio management district, and then we looked at the story of implementation, and there we found some things that were working in ways that the theory that went against kind of how the theory of the model just of how a portfolio district should operate. So one is like this assumption that, if we're going to have districts operating as portfolio managers and, really relying on principal agent theory, this idea that districts are going to be the managers, they're going to set these goals, and they're going to align schools' actions with these goals through like performance-based contracting and so on. But there's also this additional assumption that the district was going to be kind of representing all the interests at stake, right? So including the goals of districts, but also of parents and communities, and kind of crafting this coherent vision of goals and holding schools accountable for this multiple set of goals. And what we found in our analysis was that district goals were definitely represented and captured in the relationships between managers and schools, but the parent and community piece was lacking. And there were a lot of tensions that came up in our study around, between districts and parents in terms of making decisions around school closure and authorization, and that really showed that, hey, this aspect that we're assuming, should happen in practice is actually, it's not happening, and it's embedded in history, complex like racial tensions between districts, central offices, and these communities. And those are areas that, we need to still unpack and explore.
So maybe if we could just spend a minute just backing up just a little bit, just so that in case folks are not familiar, like what's a quick description of portfolio versus what I might describe as sort of a traditional command control centralized system?
Either one. You want to take it, Ayesha?
Sure. And I think this might also speak to one of the questions that we have. So yeah, and I think it's a great question. I think, we think, and this is what like the title, the one best system, what we're kind of, what we were trying to ponder on in the book, the one best system or the traditional school district is where you have an entity that is like the district that is overseeing and administering a set of schools and kind of following very standardized, often input-based processes to kind of govern how these schools are run. And so that's like in a very simplistic sense. And the portfolio approach kind of comes in and says, hey, we need more variety in the types of schools that are being available to parents. We fundamentally need to change the governance of these schools so that they are more output and goals oriented in their work and not just focusing on inputs. And the district, we still need maybe we need this district central office, but maybe the role of the district central office has to change from administering schools to now supervising an array of schools and kind of using mechanisms like performance contracting to kind of decide which schools should open and which schools should close based on their performance and other metrics and so on. Julie, is there anything else that I should have put in there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like, yeah, it's a sort of shifting away from direct management of schools. And we look in the book at what we call sort of these 5 interlocking mechanisms that are employed. So one is around planning and oversight. The second is around school choice. The third is around autonomy. The fourth is about sort of greater flexibility in human capital. And the final one's around giving support to schools that might be struggling. So, but it's essentially, the idea that we're not seeing the same kinds of schools operating under the same governance models. We're not requiring parents to just attend the school in their neighborhood zone.
Yeah.
And so there's that's sort of the shift away from the one best system would be, that idea that parents could choose, teachers and have more autonomy, and schools have more different options in terms of how they're governed. And it comes from, the kind of manager of a stock portfolio, the idea that, you're as a district now sort of looking at your diverse investments and sort of making shifts and continuously changing over time to decide like who's meeting their goals and who's not, so that over time the idea would be that you have all these schools that are high performing because you've sort of done this really performance-based sort of accountability system.
So one of the theories around it is that, or at least my interpretation of a theory around it is that in a portfolio system, particularly as it relates to parents and community, at least in theory, you might be able to get a little closer to parents and community rather than have to go back to the central admin or the school board and sort of be heard and then have it flow through a big system, that you could sort of connect to your local schools and have more of a direct connection. But you didn't find that, I'm guessing.
Right.
My reading of the book.
Yeah, I mean, we heard over in all 3, and we should say, so we looked in Los Angeles, Denver, and New Orleans in the book, right? And in all 3 of them, we heard pervasive concerns around community voice. So whether that was from the history of these changes being made, right, in New Orleans and Katrina, lots of concerns around where was the voice of the community in making these decisions around which schools were operating and how to structure this, but down to even in ongoing concerns when there was particularly around school closure and restructuring, some of the consequences of the accountability system, lots of concerns that the community's voice weren't being heard. And even as Ayesha was sort of hinting at, was that there were some racialized concerns as well, that in some of these systems we're seeing white privileged voices, particularly around these large CMO networks that are making lots of decisions that have a greater say than maybe some of those more standalone charters where you might see some of the voice of the community, as you were explaining, Van, but we weren't seeing that as much, and a lot of concern in these cities around the kind of racial dynamics that are occurring as well as this sort of limited voice.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, like, I think in our data, correct me if I'm wrong, Julie, but I think at the school level, we definitely did see interaction with parents, and it wasn't that it wasn't there. There was, like, schools were in a sense like using their autonomy to craft a mission that was responding to students' needs, families' desires to attract students into these schools. But I think it was at the system level when some of these like portfolio shaping decisions were occurring, you know, at the portfolio manager level, that's where the community voice wasn't being heard or attended to. And so, you know, decisions on like closing a school, or where to locate a school, or who should be authorized to run a school in this particular area. Those were kinds of decisions that, you know, communities may have had different intentions or desires, and they didn't feel like it was being incorporated.
I mean, a good example stands out is, you know, there was a Black mother who was telling us she was frustrated that why was the district putting another no excuses charter school in her area when there already were other no excuse schools right in that area, right? And that sort of defies the idea of the portfolio, that one, it wasn't aligned with community interests, right? And the idea was that you create sort of options for people that are varied. There wasn't a lot of variation either. And so there were some questions again about the system.
Yeah, so this is most certainly true here in Denver in terms of at least my experience and sort of some of the pushback. And one of the things that I wonder, and I don't know, I'm not sure you get into this in the book, but how do you design, whether or not it's a portfolio managed school district or if it's a traditional sort of centralized district, what advice might you have for district leaders or community leaders for having more responsive school districts to community needs and desires? Like what should happen? I mean, it's not as if, you know, the issues in the portfolio districts are significant, but as are they in non-portfolio districts in terms of being responsive to communities' desires?
Yeah. I mean, that's a big question, right? I mean, that would go in any district. I'm sure we would find families that don't feel like their voices are being heard. I mean, I think the pandemic has brought up really nice examples of how it's being done, right? So we've been seeing districts that are doing, you know, surveys that you take on your phone and online that you can sort of weigh in, you know, districts that we've seen that have had, you know, very tailored surveys to families with students with disabilities to say, like, what are your needs? What is not being met? What would you like to see, you know, before they start designing the options of what was being given in terms of online versus in-person kinds of supports. So I think there are ways to do it. And I think we've seen some of that happening in the pandemic, in fact. You know, I just was on the phone with a small district in Oregon, and they were saying they had been doing listening sessions for their families, and, you know, being able to use the web in some ways. And now that we're seeing at least some improvement in access for some of these communities that haven't had it, there's still some problems with connectivity, but there are ways to be using technology. There are ways to be kind of listening in ways that I don't think we were seeing pre-pandemic. So I think we could learn from some of those examples, I think I'd say.
Yeah, I mean, it's most certainly, I mean, as I've looked at districts here in Colorado, I mean, some of the districts that have been, quote unquote, some of the more traditional districts have been, in some ways, some of the most responsive districts to community, which isn't to say that being traditional or non-traditional is necessarily means that you're more responsive. It's just interesting that that there are lots of examples of districts sort of reaching out and trying to figure out educational pods or all kinds of interesting sort of innovations.
And I think trust is a big part of this, right? And I think that was a theme that came out of our work and has come out of a lot of people. But I mean, if you want the community's involvement, right, you need to first build that trust. And I think demonstrating that you have listened and that you've actually taken into consideration some of those views is really important, because it's one thing to keep asking and doing listening sessions and then just go and do what you want to do anyway. So there needs to be a demonstrated record there that sort of builds up that trust. And so I've always I always like this idea of small wins, where, you know, it doesn't take much as a district to sort of attend to the needs of a community member or group that's sort of asking for something. Those small wins can build not just confidence in the system being able to do what you were asking it, but actually that you would then trust them in the future to attend to your needs, even maybe when you weren't being asked, but that the district is anticipating what the community wants. So to me, this idea of small wins, I think districts can do that quite easily in lots of ways that might actually then build that involvement, engagement, support that maybe we're not seeing often.
And I would just add, I think, with the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement and districts responding to that, I think what we're seeing also is that districts need to like kind of explicitly center around equity in their work and in their leadership. And, I think the portfolio management model, while it embodies goals of equity, our research showed, right, Julie, a lot of tensions between some of the other goals of a portfolio district, such as to improve the efficiency and performance of schools, that sometimes like that came into tension with goals of equity, and maybe like efficiency kind of had the winning card and played out more to the detriment of equity. And so I think what we're seeing now is that school districts are maybe centering more around anti-racism, equity, and really engaging in these listening sessions and town halls, or to elicit community views and goals around doing right by marginalized students. And I think that just that recentering of the goals is going to lead to different sets of policy tools and engagement and interaction with communities, right, that could lead them to feel more involved in how districts are being run, and as like you and Julie are kind of talking anecdotally about what you're seeing.
And what do you think the future of these districts or of these ideas is moving forward? Do you see pendulum going back to sort of pre-portfolio times? Do you see people building on sort of lessons learned from this and sort of taking sort of the best stuff and fixing those things, per the earlier point about sort of equity being maybe losing out on efficiency, but maybe now next time equity being trumping efficiency?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I mean, a lot has changed even in the three cities that we studied, which very well, Van, being in Denver, right? Yeah. So, already we're seeing the sort of dismantling of some of these structures. Denver, we held up this idea that there was that collaborative council of charters, and right. I mean, so much has changed in Denver. The strength of the teachers union has created, right? There's so many changes since we wrote the book in just a few years ago. So I would argue that I think things are shifting again a bit away from the portfolio idea, but charter schools are here to stay. I mean, they're not going anywhere. And so I do think that their districts, regardless of whether they adopt what they call a portfolio or not, are still needing to think about ways of whether they want to engage their charters as part of their system or whether they're going to keep them separate in the way that LAUSD has done. And I think that's going to be an interesting area to watch. So for example, the enrollment systems, right? So Denver and New Orleans have the common enrollment systems. LAUSD resisted that for years and years, but it leads to these concerns around cream skimming and all the different kinds of gaming strategies and the sort of uneven playing field that occurs in the charter sector. I wonder if there will be greater support in an LAUSD for bringing the charter enrollment system more in line. Again, you have to have trust between the sectors to do that, which I think you had in Denver at the time when that was created. But I do wonder if our concerns over equity and the acknowledgement that charters are not going away might lead to more of these kinds of centralized portfolio-like structures in order to advance equity while still maintaining some of these choice mechanisms in school districts.
Great. Ayesha, do you want to add any last things? We're getting close to the end of our time here.
I just wanted to respond to the Q&A. So there was someone asking if there are non-portfolio districts serving majority FRL students who are performing well or better than portfolio districts. I think that's a great question to ask. And I think, in our book, we acknowledge that, while we're seeing kind of the one best system fall apart at the fringes and portfolio districts are kind of amongst this new trend that's occurring, there are other types of districts. So I'm thinking about improvement science or networked improvement community districts that are engaging in fundamentally different approaches to school improvement that could, that could have better outcomes or worse than portfolio districts. I haven't studied or done that kind of comparative analysis, but there are definitely different other kinds of models of district level change that are out there and that should be studied. Others are, like we mentioned, like state takeover districts, mayoral control districts, charter school networks kind of operating as maybe, independent districts. I mean, these are all other approaches that, again, are kind of deviating from the one best system and really should be studied in terms of implementation and outcomes.
Great. Well, time flies when talking about school districts. We're at the end of our time. I want to invite folks, to check out the book and check out their work and their co-authors' work, because it's great stuff. And I also want to thank my colleagues, Mary and Edward, for helping with the technical support and getting the webinar up. And I also want to invite folks to our next one. So we're trying to have these every couple of weeks. And so the next one is going to be on March 30th. And we're going to talk about the future of food, work, and school and all of their connections. So it'll be a little different topic. And we've got Adrian Miller, an old friend who's the Soul Food Scholar, and Zach Newmeyer, who's the chairman of Sage Hospitality. They run a bunch of hotels and restaurants around the world. And then on April 9th, another really good one for, which will be with actually, I guess, Julie's colleague, Pedro Nagura, and Rick Hess, talking about their latest book, A Search for Common Ground, in regards to how the right and the left on the education fronts might be able to find some common ground and work together in these super polarizing times. So I want to thank both of you for joining us, and it was a real pleasure, and hope you have a great rest of your days. Thank you.